Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
All you citizens of the world, welcome back to Live from the Heartland. I'm really glad to bring on our next guest. It's Jonathan Alter. And the way this came to be was an encounter between Live from the Heartland producer Katie Hogan and Jonathan. I believe they met on a bus on their way to the Democratic Convention this past fall. And Katie gave me his card, which I lost. But when I was thinking about guests, I thought, well, I got to try to find this fellow. And I did. And Jonathan Alter is a well-known author. Done a recent book on Trump, did one on Jimmy Carter, Obama, etc. And I'm really glad you're here. So good afternoon to you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. It's good to be here.
We got a lot to talk about. It's not been a very good week on a lot of fronts. We see over in Hungary with Orban changing the constitution about LGBT people. We have a situation in El Salvador. We have Trump refusing to comply with the courts. But I thought rather than delve into that kind of stuff, we might want to start with one of your books. It's about Jimmy Carter. I believe it was called His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. And while I had disagreements with Carter at different times in my life, I really love and respect the man. I did see him once when I was in Nicaragua during the election. How about sharing a little bit about your experiences with Jimmy Carter?
Well, my first experience with him was when I was in college and I was an intern in the speechwriting office of the Carter White House. And I only met him once that summer, but this gives you an idea of how long ago it was, 1978. There was a speech that he was scheduled to give at a tobacco warehouse in North Carolina, and none of the real speechwriters wanted to write a pro-tobacco speech, so they made the intern do it. And then Carter, he didn't really give the speech, but he often would depart from the text, and he departed from the text to say, I'm going to make cigarette smoking even safer than it already is. And John Fischetti, who some of your listeners might remember, was this fantastic cartoonist for the old Chicago Daily News and a family friend. He did a wonderful cartoon about Carter's speech where Carter had shot himself in the foot, So, which he did on rather frequent occasions when he was president. But I agree with you that he was not only a decent man, but a much undervalued American president, and that's a lot of what my book is about. But I didn't encounter him again until I was a Newsweek columnist, and I went to a Habitat for Humanity site in the Bronx and talked to him briefly. I interviewed him for my column. This was right after Bill Clinton had tried to do this deal between Yasser Arafat and Israel, where they turned over 98% of what the Palestinians wanted, but Arafat at the last minute backed out of the deal. And so I was doing a column on that. And I remember that Carter told me that day, well, of course Arafat had to back out because if he had signed the deal, he would have been assassinated, which I put in Newsweek and found kind of interesting. And then I didn't really have any contact with him for 15 years. And I'm in a book group in New York, and we were reading a book about Camp David, and somebody in our group knew Jason Carter, Jimmy's grandson, who had just run and come close to getting elected governor of Georgia, and he brought his grandfather with him to our book group. He was 90 years old, and after that evening, I'm thinking, my God, this guy was so sharp and so smart, not just on Camp David, but on human rights and the other things that we talked about. I'd like to do a book about him. And there has to be more to this guy than mediocre president, great former president. And it turned out that my editor was his editor at Simon & Schuster, and she smoothed the way for me. And so I had total access to him and his entire family. And I interviewed him altogether 13 times and like 6 or 7 times in person. And then I did some email interviews with him and phone interviews, and was in touch with him regularly by email until he had a fall in 2019 and couldn't see anymore and do email. So, and then I last saw him when my wife and I went to his and Rosalind's 75th wedding anniversary, which was a couple of years ago, before they first, she passed first, and then Jimmy Carter. And, you know, just in terms of my overall impression of him and the time I spent with him, I also built a house in Memphis for Habitat with Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. And I spent the day with them, one day hammering instructions from the former president. And my impression of him was pretty much the same as it had been that first night at the book club, which was just of an enormously intelligent person, extraordinarily knowledgeable on a very wide variety of subjects, who was surprisingly undefensive about his presidency, and genial in our interactions, even though I knew that he could be snappish and prickly. And I only saw that a couple of times. One point when we were touring the Naval Academy, which he had attended, and he snapped at me when he thought I asked him a dumb question. But other than that, I just saw the genial, intelligent, decent Jimmy Carter, and learned a lot from him. And I think spending time with him and pretty much everybody in his family, I did the first interview ever with Amy Carter. You know, it let me draw a rounded portrait. Just one more thing, because I know you want to ask other questions. There was one moment when he became uncomfortable in our interviews, even though I asked him a lot of hard questions. And that was when we were talking about the 1970 campaign for governor of Georgia, where he played the race card. He didn't say anything explicitly racist, but he said that he would welcome George Wallace to come over from Alabama and address the state legislature, which he never invited him because, you know, he didn't like Wallace. But he did other things, and I was questioning him about this, and he said, you know, I never claimed to be part of the civil rights movement. And then we talked about how on his first day as governor, just moments after taking the oath, he said the time for racial discrimination is over, and became the Jimmy Carter that we know and love as governor of Georgia, integrating Georgia, and then integrating the federal government of the United States, or moving it from tokenism to true diversity. But before that, when I was questioning him about his pandering, he said to me, "Are we done talking about this yet?" And I said, "President Carter, not quite yet. I have a few more questions on this." But other than that, and even that was done in a relatively genial fashion, you know, my experience with him was delightful.
Well, on another note, they have a different president now, and one that I don't think has any redeeming qualities. We're clearly in a crucial time. We're confronting an ideological administration that really exudes cruelty and evil. You also did a book on the current president called American Reckoning: Inside Trump's Trial and Your Own. How about a little bit on that, and that'll take us into talking about the current situation with the current orange-haired president.
Okay. I didn't want to write any kind of a book about Trump. And actually, I found during the 5 years I was working on his very best, the Jimmy Carter biography, Carter provided me a vacation from Trump. So he couldn't occupy, live rent free in my brain because Jimmy Carter occupied the premises. But then, at a certain point, I realized, look, I mean, I owe it to my readers on Old Goats, which is my Substack newsletter, and to readers in general to bear witness. And so I was able to obtain a credential for the Trump felony trial, the Stormy Daniels trial. I was one of the only people who was in the courtroom every day. That trial was untelevised. If it had been televised, Donald Trump never would have been reelected. And I felt like because I had been able to get this credential that I really had to lean into this. And so I started keeping a diary, and my book is partly my trial diary. And people might go, oh, well, he won anyway. They didn't hold him accountable just because he got convicted. But actually, the judge held him accountable almost every day in the courtroom, not just by citing him for contempt of court, which if it had been any other president would have been a huge story, but with Trump was not even the biggest story of the day. But, a lot of really, really negative stuff about Trump came out at that trial. And I knew that people wouldn't go back to the transcripts. And even though I was covering it for the opinion section of the New York Times and other people were writing about it a lot, I felt like all of us missed a huge amount about what it actually felt like to be in that courtroom, watch Stormy Daniels pour a bucket of slop over Donald Trump's head every day with him being unable to reply and having to sit in the court and listen to all of that when he wasn't asleep. So, a lot of the book is about that, but the first part of the book is really about Chicago. It's a mini memoir of my growing up and coming of age as a journalist and various things that happened to me that influenced my life as a journalist. Most significantly, when Martin Luther King came to our house on the North Side when I was 8 years old and delivered a kind of a mini I Have a Dream speech in our living room. It was a fundraiser to try to raise money for an event that he held at Soldier Field. And he was feuding with Mayor Daley at the time, as you might remember, Michael. And so this had an enormous impact on me. And I became, at age 8 years old, I'm absorbing the daily news and the Sun Times. We didn't take the Tribune for obvious reasons in those days. And this is what sort of made me a journalist. And then just very quickly, the other experience in my family that was very influential on my development as a journalist happened 9 years before I was born. And that is that my late mother, Joanne Alter, who was the first woman elected in Cook County as commissioner of the Metropolitan Sanitary District. And, she went on to run for lieutenant governor and other offices, but became maybe better known as founding the WITS program, the largest tutoring program in the Chicago housing projects. But when she was the first person in her family to go to college, and she was at Mount Holyoke, she was asked to give Eleanor Roosevelt a tour of campus. And so she did. And then afterward, Eleanor says, "Now, where do you live, Joanne?" And my mother says, I live, my dorm's over on the other side of campus. She said, "Oh, I must see your dormitory." And so the most famous woman in the world plops down on her bed. Says, now, Joanne, tell me all about yourself. Where are you from? And uh, how do you want to make a better world? And this just floored my mother, and it changed her life. And it, made her curious about other people, which is the foundation of journalism. So it was no surprise that 3 of her children became journalists. And she infected my father with this, and they got very involved in politics and the civil rights movement. And my interest in politics, it comes, through that Eleanor Roosevelt experience that my mother had. And we now have the Joanne Alter Women in Politics lecture at the Chicago Humanities Festival every year, which is kind of an outgrowth of, you can draw a line from Eleanor Roosevelt to that. So that's the kind of thing that I write about in my book. And then I write about, I've interviewed 9 American presidents, either before, during, or after they left office. And I write about that some in my book as well, as trying to contextualize Trump and the evil, as you rightly put it, that he represents.
Well, you bring back some memories. I remember seeing Paul Douglas and Dr. King driving into Soldier Field. It was probably the summer of '66.
It was. That was the only time King was in Soldier Field.
Yeah, and then a couple of years later, and I gave a speech at the Coliseum along with King and Dr. Spock. King was a real hero of mine. I mean, there were times I was critical, but he was something else.
Paul Douglas, that was the year he lost for the Senate, and that was my first political experience. My parents were very friendly with Paul Douglas, and I was at his campaign headquarters as he was losing to Chuck Percy. At that point, I had just turned 9, so I was a little older.
Well, you've been involved for a long time. I'm a little older than you. I go back to 1952. I remember going to Adlai Stevenson headquarters in my hometown to pick up some literature with my dad. Let's move to the current situation and Trump, et cetera. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on why, after the Republicans, or the Goppers, as I call them, GOP, they had a trifecta in the last election, and they really did have an opportunity to pursue a probably traditional conservative agenda. Why do you think they went for white supremacy, et cetera?
I mean, I don't see them going for white supremacy. I mean, there were quite a number of African Americans who voted for Trump. I see them going for fascism.
Okay,
so that's what we have. I mean, we are in the presence of an authentic American fascist, and he is following every part of the authoritarian playbook, and in some cases going quite a bit further than other authoritarians. And when you start spiriting people out of the country in the middle of the night without due process, that's what dictators and fascists do. So that's what we're experiencing right now. And why did all these Republicans go for it? Because they're not actually conservatives in any traditional meaning of that word, right. Conservative. What they are is gutless politicians who know better, but in order to protect their political career, because they don't want to be, I don't know what, obscure lawyers back home, they are making common cause with this fascist who they think is the reason they're in office. And look, I mean, every American is facing the character test of their generation. Whether they believe in the ideals on which this country was founded or are willing to bend the knee to a would-be tyrant. And it's binary, and some people are in the cult of personality that Donald Trump has established, but most people are not. I mean, that base is 35% of the country, in total. And you can say, well, those people are lost. You can't argue with them. They're beyond hope of political redemption because they're in some sort of a cult. But everybody else, including the 15% of that got Trump to close to 50%, those are independents and Republicans who didn't like Kamala Harris for whatever reason, and they are facing a real character test. Like, what do they believe? And then these people at law firms who are bending the knee, they're flunking their character test. The president of Harvard just passed his character test.
No, he did great.
So it's binary. It's pass fail, and if you bend the knee, that way is tyranny. So everybody has to resist. Everybody has to ask themselves, what am I doing to help resist? I can't spend my whole life at it, but I can do a little bit. I can show up at one of these protests. I can, give a little bit of money to one of these organizations that's doing a great job in resisting. Whatever people can do, listen to this program. Community building is a very important part of resistance. Staying on top of it, not going, I can't stand this Trump news. You don't want to tell your grandchildren, what did you do? Well, I had to tune it all out. It was too upsetting for me. That doesn't work when we're accounting for ourselves in the future about what we did. So for my part, all I can do is bear witness in this trial, tell people about, there's a lot in my book about, Trump and his love for Nazis. People don't even know this, that, he had a book of Hitler's speeches that his ex-wife said he was reading years ago, right? And so, like, there's a lot that people think they know everything about him, but there's a lot about his evil that they don't know. And having met him, he threatened to sue me many years ago. I live in the New York area. So I've been, I interviewed him years ago. So, and then I saw him every day in court for 23 days. And one of the great pleasures of that, Michael, was every time the jury went in and out, 8 times a day, he had to stand and honor these ordinary people who were a jury of his peers. And then they convicted him on 34 counts, which was witnessing that, being a few feet away from the foreperson when he says guilty, guilty, guilty 34 times, was one of the highlights of my whole life.
Let me ask you a little bit about who's running the show behind him. Is this guy Miller? There was a thing on Facebook someone sent me about Vance and the head of PayPal. These guys are involved in some kind of dark Christian ideological sect. Yeah. Any take on any of that?
Yeah, well, Peter Thiel is the guy who was the co-founder of PayPal, and he financed Vance's whole campaign for the Senate in Ohio, and Peter Thiel, who's a bad actor, Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, Stephen Miller. These are the people who are, running the country. I mean, you may have noticed from the Oval Office set piece from day before yesterday, which was just outrageous, where Miller, they're basically they're ghosting, they're gaslighting the American public about the facts of the Brago Garcia case. Everything that came out of Miller's mouth was a lie, and we'll see if the judge holds him in contempt. I think that might be in the immediate future, and that would be wonderful. But another thing that got my attention was Trump says in that meeting that Supreme Court decision, how did that come out? Was it 9-0? Did it come out in our favor? And they tell him erroneously, it came out in our favor. It did not come in our favor. It was 9-0 against Trump. But that was a sign of how disengaged Trump was. He didn't even know. He's so busy watching television and keeping score about how to get even with his rivals and get his revenge, his retribution, as he called it during the campaign, that he's not even on top of what everybody's doing. He doesn't know what Elon Musk is doing and vandalizing the federal government. So these people are operating in his name. He's letting them operate in his name. But those four people, Musk, Miller, Thiel, and Vance, are running the country.
Yeah, not for the best, that's for sure.
Sure.
Do you think the courts will be able to hold, and do you think the Republicans in the Senate, maybe perhaps to all of Congress, will they break with him? Your predictions?
Well, these are so. I'm not sounding Pollyannish, optimistic. I don't think either is warranted, but I think one can be legitimately hopeful. And my answer to both of your questions is yes. I believe the courts are holding. Does that mean that every Supreme Court decision we're going to like? No. I think that there's a really bad one coming up soon where I predict that Trump will be able to have control of the Federal Trade Commission, National Labor Relations Board, all of these previously independent commissions, and that they will give it to him. And that, Roosevelt wanted control. My first book is about Franklin Roosevelt, who I revere. It's about Roosevelt's first 100 days. He was on Trump's side of that issue. He wanted control of these independent regulatory agencies. The Supreme Court ruled against him in the Humphreys case. They're not going to reverse Humphreys, and they're going to give the president control of all these agencies. So that's going to be bad. But on the good side, I do think that this latest 9-0 decision shows that they are going to hold firm on due process, which is so elemental to our freedom, and other very important things. And they may even hold firm on Congress having the power of the purse, which would mean some of these, cuts to cancer research and other outrageous things that are going on will be reversed. There'll be a lot lost in the meantime. There'll be a lot of permanent damage, but eventually, we're going to come out the other end. As far as senators peeling off him, that all depends on how low he goes in the polls. And how low he goes in the polls depends on the economy. So if we have a recession, he will be neutered. Donald Trump will be neutered first in the midterm elections. And then after that, he'll still get some things done because the president can be very powerful, but he won't have his way with his bitches in the Republican caucus of the U.S. Senate, because they'll be looking to their own reelections, and they'll realize that if they side too much with him, they have a problem already. And this is the best news, Michael, of the last few weeks. I want people to understand this was such good news out of Wisconsin. It wasn't just that the Democrat won for the Supreme Court by 10 points. It's that the Republican lost in part because the Democrat wrung Elon Musk around his neck and made it seem as if it was Musk's puppet. Now, why is this? And it worked. It won by 10 points. Why is this so important? Because I was very worried that Musk was going to buy the midterms, where how much you spend is often determines who wins. But now, if he contributes in one of these swing districts, if it contributes even a nickel to the Republican, the Democrat has a great issue, saying the Republican, he's Elon Musk's puppet. He's the puppet of the billionaires. And this will work in 2026. So Musk has already been neutered as a political force. The next thing is to neuter Trump. And when that happens, we can start to get our country back from these fascists.
Let me ask you about the Democratic Party and any thoughts on them going forward, but particularly this kind of youth movement where like David Hogg and other people are challenging some old line Democrats here in the 9th District in Chicago, which was Sid Yates' old district, and Jan Schakowsky, a very good friend. She's being challenged by some influencer. Your thoughts on that and the where that ends up?
So in general, I think the Democrats have become a gerontocracy. And, I was for Joe Biden stepping down starting in 2022, or not stepping down, but not being a candidate for reelection. And I thought, so it's a real problem and we need generational change. But that doesn't mean you throw out everybody. And that doesn't mean you replace Jan Schakowsky with an influencer.
Right.
You have to use your head too. And so just because somebody's young doesn't mean you need to be for them. You can still be for the party, having people like David Hogg, as he's now the deputy director of the Democratic National Committee. That kind of thing is very important to do. We have to obviously nominate a young candidate for president. I think where there are primary fights, there are certain situations where it's time for the older person to retire. But, I remember Sid Yates, when he was quite old, he was challenged by a friend of mine. And I was for Yates because, he could do more for my district on Capitol Hill. And I think Schakowsky can do more for people in her Chicago district than this influencer. So the other problem I have with these primary challenges, I want Democratic donors to save their money for the general election in 2026. These swing district candidates are going to need it to knock out the 5 incumbents, the 5 Republicans, so that Democrats can take control. So don't spend your money on silly primary fights, and don't spend your money on purification rituals for progressives. Like this whole thing of eating our own or giving candidates these progressive litmus tests. If you don't check out every box that we have as progressives, we're not for you. Well, we can't afford that because we have a fascist who's president of the United States. So like all of these internecine things in the Democratic Party, he's not progressive enough for me. That shit has to stop. And we have to get the House back. And then that's the beginning of getting our country back.
Let me ask you about Gaza. And Gaza kind of splitting the world in some ways. And here at home, younger people who the Democrats need are really turned off by the refusal of some Democrats to really take a stand. What do you think the implication of that will be, and how do we deal with it?
Well, it's a real problem. I'm not minimizing it at all as a problem, but I think it's a problem that we cannot afford at this time. So, I'm really struck. I'm Jewish. I despise the Netanyahu government, and I noticed all these demonstrations against the Netanyahu government. Where are the demonstrations against Trump? Really?
Yeah.
And so this, again, this idea that, we can't support Democrats because, they're not good enough on Gaza. Well, compared to what? Compared to Trump. So this is something that has really, really harmed Democrats and really harmed, and young people just have to understand, look, I know you don't like either party. The Democratic Party is very unpopular now. And the Democrats have a lot of work to do on communicating better, I think particularly on economic issues, on showing that they really are on the side of working families. And, they've made a lot of mistakes, but just be smart about this. Like you basically, to save your freedom, to make sure that you are not carted off to a Salvadoran jail. And don't think it can't happen to you if you've taken part in a pro-Palestinian demonstration. Don't think it can't happen to you if you're a U.S. citizen. They will do this. This is what has become clear. So forget about whatever your concerns are with Democrats not being good enough on Gaza. That's last year's issue. That's not what we need to be concerned about right now. And just enough. And, enough on this. And does that mean that you have to no longer express your views on Gaza? Of course not. But you don't have to say, well, I can't support that Democrat because they don't go down the line with me on everything, and they are pro-Zionist, so I can't support that Democrat. So what are you going to get? You're going to get a Trump robot who is going to, defend the right of Trump to cart you off in the middle of the night? Get smart. Get intelligent about this. These are luxuries Democrats can no longer afford. It's the narcissism of small differences. Have you ever heard of that?
I'm going to look it up. Let me ask you. You had mentioned Democrats should probably have a younger candidate next time, and one of my producers asked me your thoughts on the current Illinois governor Pritzker, whether he should run. And I'm going to throw in there a guy like Andy Beshear, who's been an interesting fellow down there in Kentucky. Any thoughts on who might be likely candidates going forward?
Well, we don't really know, who it's going to be, and it's way too early. So Jimmy Carter, at this point in the 1976 cycle, he was at 0% in the polls, and they told Ms. Lilly and his mother, Jimmy's running for president, and his mother's response was, president of what? He was a former governor. She thought he might be president of a university, So it could be, there's a lot of different people it could be, and I think it's a little bit premature. I mean, we're just seeing people strut their stuff. So like Chris Murphy has been breaking out a little bit. I don't know if he's the right candidate, but he's been breaking out. Cory Booker's been breaking out. I like the idea of Andy Beshear, the Democratic governor of Kentucky, because he can win in red states. That's very, very important. And he's young, and I'd like to see him as a candidate. I support J.B. Pritzker as governor. And, he was a friend of my late mother. I don't think he's the right candidate for the Democrats.
Yeah, I agree.
The reason is because he's a billionaire. And part of the campaign has to be against the party of billionaires, and that's the Republican Party. And if you confuse the issue by having your candidate be a billionaire and you're arguing against tax cuts for billionaires, which is what part of the campaign will be, because the Republicans will get through a tax cut for billionaires this year. I don't think JB is the right guy, but I do think that JB should be tapped, even if he's not the candidate, to put $200 or $300 million into the campaign of the Democrat, which he can afford to do, because it's that important that Vance, or whoever it is, not be reelected. And by the way, for people who are worried about Trump, he's not going to be the candidate in 2028. It's not just because he's barred constitutionally. He's not going to have the political standing for it by that time. I
hope he doesn't have the physical stature too.
that too. So people, I'm always asked about that. People need to worry about the things that are happening right now, like them trying to end due process and the rule of law, which are central to our republic. So it's not about what's going to happen in 2028, whether he's going to run again. It's about, whether he will carry out court orders, and that hangs in the balance.
Let me ask you, if you really think there will be an election in 2026. Senator
Yes.
Murphy in Connecticut says we should fear that there won't be a free and fair election.
Well, there's
got any predictions on that one?
Yeah. So there's a distinction between whether there will be an election and whether those elections will be free and fair.
Good point.
Will there be an election? 100%. And people who think that Trump can cancel elections with martial law or whatever, they weren't canceled when we had, during the Civil War. And they're in not just 50 states, but literally thousands of counties. So no, elections will not be canceled. Will they be free and fair? I think that's a fair question. And we have a group of people in the United States who are determined for them not to be free and fair. Now, the executive order that Trump signed and the bill, the SAFE bill or whatever it's called, that the Republicans in the House support, is not going to pass. And the executive order is a dead letter. It has no force of law. He has no authority over elections, which are done at the local level, state and local level. So we don't have to worry about that. But what we do have to worry about is them getting a lot of people into the machinery of vote counting, which they've been very diligent in doing, who don't believe in elections that they don't win, right? And they will do anything to prevent people from voting if they think they're Democrats, or challenge the results if they're legitimate. If their side loses, and there'll be a lot of that right after the 2026 elections where they lose, because that's the way they roll. As Joe Biden said, they don't believe in any election that they didn't win. And we have one political party that feels this way, and they can prevent free and fair elections in certain jurisdictions. That's why it's important to be an election judge. That's why it's important to contribute to these organizations like the Brennan Center that are fighting for free and fair elections. But the Brennan Center has a lot of money, and they're going to have a lot of money, a real lot of money, because there are a lot of Democrats and independents and former Republicans who understand that this is an issue. So the Democrats are going to be very well financed in 2026 in terms of trying to make sure that these elections are fair.
This is really wonderful talking to you, Jonathan Alter, and I hope I can twist your arm and get you back on again. Let me ask you one last question. Sure. What do you do for fun?
Well, basically what I do for fun is that on Mondays and Tuesdays, my wife and I babysit our two granddaughters who are ages 3 and almost 1. And it's very tiring, but also really fun. So that's what I did on Monday and Tuesday of this week and of other weeks. And then I also, I report on things that are not Trump related, which I consider to be fun. So my next book is about Julius Caesar, and I guess that is Trump related, but at least 1,000 years ago. And then I'm working on a long magazine article about an imposter, and every hour that I spend on that is fun because it's an hour of work that is not about Donald Trump. And then I do like to ski and hike, so I'm not completely without non-political passions.
Well, I want to really thank you. You've been a wonderful guest on Live from the Heartland.